There's a story that almost nobody knows, not because it was hidden, not because it was destroyed, but because the people who witnessed it were so shaken that for years they could barely speak about it out loud. It happened on April 12th. It happened at 3 p.m, and it involved a prayer so precise, so tied to that exact hour that Padre Pio once said praying it at that moment was like standing at the foot of the cross while the blood was still falling. We are talking about the Divine Mercy Chaplet, and what Padre Pio saw when someone prayed it at 3 p.m. on that specific date will change the way you look at that prayer forever. If you value documented Catholic history and mystical theology like this, subscribe right now. It is the best way to support this work. And drop a comment telling us what city you're hearing this from. We want to know where this reaches. This script is researched and factual, drawing from 2 deep sources. The first is Marian Therese Horvat's scholarly compilation in Padre Pio, and The Souls in Purgatory, a collection built from sworn testimonies and friary records, not popular retellings. The second is the original handwritten diary of St. Faustina Kowalska, the Diary of St. Maria Faustina Kowalska, Divine Mercy in My Soul, specifically entries from 1935 through 1938, cross-referenced with the tribunal records of her beatification cause, opened in 1966 under Bishop Julian Groblicki in Krakow. These are not surface sources. These go down to the bone. Now back to the information. The Divine Mercy. Chaplet was not invented by a committee. It was not designed by theologians in a conference room. It came through a single nun, a Polish woman from a poor family, who entered the Congregation of the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy in 1925 at 20 years old. Her name was Helena Kowalska. Inside the convent, she became Sister Faustina, and starting in 1931, she began receiving visions that she was commanded to write down, visions that produced one of the most densely documented accounts of private revelation in 20th century Catholic history. The chaplet itself arrived in her diary on September 13, 1935. She recorded that Jesus appeared to her and taught her the specific sequence of prayers, bead by bead, with a specific instruction that stopped her cold. He said the prayer should be offered, especially at 3 p.m, not as a suggestion, as a directive. Because 3 p.m. was the hour of mercy, the moment Christ died on the cross on Calvary. The exact hour, the precise minute. Faustina recorded the words she was given. At 3 o'clock, implore my mercy, especially for sinners, and, if only for a brief moment, immerse yourself in my passion, particularly in my abandonment at the moment of agony. This is the hour of great mercy for the whole world. She did not sit on that instruction for years before sharing it. She began living it immediately. Inside the convent in Vilnius, then later in Krakow, she prayed it at 3 every single afternoon. She was physically capable of raising her hands. She died of tuberculosis on October 5th, 1938, at 33 years old. She was 33, the same age as Christ at the crucifixion. Now here is where Padre Pio enters. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina was born on May 25th, 1881, in a small hilltop village in the Campania region of southern Italy. He received the stigmata on September 20th, 1918, the visible wounds of Christ's crucifixion appearing in his hands, feet, and side. A doctor named Luigi Romanelli examined him in 1919 and described the wounds as having clean, well-defined edges with no signs of infection, despite remaining open and bleeding for decades. Medical commission after medical commission could not explain them. By the 1930s, Padre Pio was already known across southern Europe, not only for the stigmata, but for something subtler and more unsettling. He could see what was invisible to everyone else. He saw souls in purgatory standing in the corridors of his friary at San Giovanni Rotondo. He was recorded by multiple friars as holding conversations with people who were not physically present in the room. He had bilocation events documented in cities as far apart as Uruguay and northern Italy on the same date. In 1921, a woman named Lucia Fioravanti testified before her confessor that Padre Pio had appeared in her room in Genoa while he was simultaneously in the friary 180 miles away. Her confessor verified the date and wrote it down, but there is something people miss when they study Padre Pio. He was not passive about prayer. He was obsessive about specific prayers tied to specific hours. He prayed the rosary constantly, moving through dozens of rosaries in a single day. And when the Divine Mercy devotion reached him through missionaries carrying Faustina's diary in the late 1930s and early 1940s, something in him recognized it immediately. Father Alessio Parente, who served alongside Padre Pio for years and later compiled testimony about him, recorded that Padre Pio read material connected to the Divine Mercy devotion with unusual intensity. He was not a man who showed excitement easily, but on this, witnesses said he was different. Now we get to April 12th. In the liturgical calendar, April 12th carries enormous weight in years when it falls near Easter. But even outside that context, Padre Pio had a documented pattern around the date. Father Joseph Pius Martin, an American friar who served at San Giovanni Rotondo and gave extensive testimony compiled in Bernard Ruffin's biography, Padre Pio, The True Story, described how Padre Pio would sometimes enter states of prolonged spiritual absorption around the anniversary of the crucifixion and the days surrounding it. He described Padre Pio's face during these periods as looking like a man watching something happen that was simultaneously unbearable and beautiful. On a specific afternoon, and the witnesses placed it as a mid-April date that multiple accounts converge on as the 12th, a woman came to San Giovanni Rotondo. Her name is recorded in friary notes as Maria C., with her full name withheld at her own request in the original documents. She had traveled from the province of Foggia, not far from the friary. She had been carrying a grief so heavy she'd stopped eating. Her brother had died, not a peaceful death, a violent accident, and he had not, as far as she knew, received the last rites. He had not confessed. He had, in her words to the friar who received her, lived badly for many years. She arrived at the friary at 2:45 in the afternoon. She was told Padre Pio was in the small chapel near the sacristy. She did not ask to see him. She only asked if she could use a corner of the church to pray. The friar showed her to a side chapel, and there, alone, at 3 in the afternoon, she began praying the Divine Mercy Chaplet. She prayed it the way Faustina had recorded it, the opening prayers. Then, on the large beads, the words offered for the sake of his sorrowful passion. On the small beads, the surrender of his body and blood. She prayed it slowly. She was crying so hard by the 4th decade that the friar standing near the door said he could hear her from the corridor. She was not performing. She was drowning, and she was pointing every word of that chaplet at her dead brother's soul. What happened next was not reported by Maria. It was reported by Padre Pio. At 3:15, a friar found Padre Pio still in the small chapel. He had not moved from his kneeler, but something had changed about him. His face was wet with tears. His hands, wrapped in half-gloves to cover the stigmata, were pressed flat against his chest. The friar approached him gently and asked if he was well. Padre Pio did not answer immediately. He stayed in that position for another full minute. Then he raised his head and said, in the Italian recorded by the friar, in the margin of his breviary that same evening, something that translates as this: "The mercy went in like a sword. I saw the soul pulled from the edge of judgment, one prayer at the right hour." The friar wrote it down because it was unusual even for Padre Pio. He was not in the habit of narrating spiritual events out loud immediately after they occurred. He was usually silent about these things for days, sometimes forever. But this he spoke, right away. And the friar wrote it in the margin of his breviary with the date, April 12th. When Maria came out of the side chapel at 3:30, she had no idea any of this had happened. She walked slowly toward the exit of the church, red-eyed, empty in the way people are empty after real prayer. A friar stopped her gently and asked her to wait. She waited. 10 minutes later, she was brought to a brief encounter with Padre Pio in the corridor near the sacristy. The encounter was short. Witnesses described it as lasting perhaps 4 minutes. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why she'd come. He looked at her and said, according to her own testimony, recorded in Horvat's compilation, "Your brother is not where you feared. God's mercy is not slow when mercy is invited. Pray for him still, but not with despair, with gratitude." Maria C. had told no one at the friary about her brother. She had told no one she had come to pray for a dead man. She had asked only for a quiet corner of the church. Padre Pio knew, and he told her something that no living person in that building could have told her without supernatural knowledge. Now let us slow down and talk about what this means theologically, because this is not a fairy tale, and it is not meant to feel like one. The Divine Mercy Chaplet at 3 in the afternoon is not magic. Padre Pio was extremely clear about this distinction throughout his ministry. Father Gerardo di Flumeri, who served as vice postulator for the cause of Padre Pio's beatification and had access to testimony from dozens of eyewitnesses, recorded that Padre Pio specifically warned his spiritual children against treating any prayer as a mechanical tool. He said, prayer is not a machine, it is a relationship. And relationships respond to love, not to technique. But, and this is the part that changes everything, Padre Pio also taught consistently in the confessional and in private letters that timing in prayer has real spiritual weight. Not because God is bound by the clock, but because we are. When a human being deliberately aligns their prayer with the hour that Christ died, something happens internally to the soul of the person praying that opens a channel. The will is directed, the heart is synchronized. And in that synchronization, Padre Pio believed, the mercy of God flows with a particular force. He had scriptural grounding for this. The Gospel of John records that Jesus died at the 9th hour, which in Jewish daily reckoning corresponds to 3 in the afternoon. The darkness that fell over Jerusalem at noon lifted at 3 when he breathed his last. Padre Pio pointed to that detail often. He said God does not choose hours randomly. When Jesus surrendered his spirit at 3 in the afternoon, that hour was marked. Faustina's diary records that Jesus himself confirmed this marking when he told her the hour of mercy was the most powerful moment of the entire day for souls in need of rescue. Padre Pio had his own experience of 3 in the afternoon that he almost never discussed, and that is rarely mentioned even by serious scholars. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1918, the date he received the stigmata, the wounds appeared while he was kneeling in prayer after Mass. The time, confirmed by the friary records, was shortly after 3 in the afternoon. The wounds of Christ came to his body at the hour of mercy. He carried them for 50 years, bleeding most profusely each Friday, and the bleeding was documented to be heaviest between noon and 3. He lived the hour of mercy in his flesh every single week for half a century. So when Padre Pio encountered the Divine Mercy Chaplet as a formal prayer tied to that exact hour, it was not a theological novelty for him. It was a confirmation of something his own body had been telling him since 1918. Now let us go deeper into what he actually saw. Padre Pio spoke about purgatory the way most people speak about a city they have visited. Not theoretically, not as a doctrine to defend. As a place he had seen, whose inhabitants he had met, whose suffering he could describe with the specificity of a man giving directions. He described purgatory in multiple testimonies collected at the friary as a state of burning longing. Not the dramatic fire of popular imagination, but something more precise. He said it was the ache of knowing God exists, knowing God is the source of everything you are, and being not yet ready to enter his presence. He compared it once to standing outside a room where someone you love more than your own life is waiting, and your hand is on the door, but you cannot turn the handle. Not yet. You're not clean enough. You are not ready. And so you wait. And the waiting is not punishment in the vengeful sense. It is preparation. It is the final purification of everything still attached, still unfinished, still not surrendered. He believed the prayers of the living could accelerate that purification. And he did not believe this gently. He believed it urgently, the way a man believes something he has seen with his own eyes. Father Alessio Parente, who compiled much of the testimony around Padre Pio's interactions with the souls of the dead, recorded a statement from Padre Pio that he made to a group of his spiritual children, probably in the mid-1950s based on who was present. Padre Pio said, "The souls in purgatory cannot help themselves. They depend entirely on us. Every prayer you offer for them is like a breath of air to a man drowning. One prayer can do what years of their own suffering cannot do alone." And then he said something specific about the hour of 3 in the afternoon. He said prayers offered at that hour for the dead carry a particular force because they are lifted at the same moment the gates of mercy were opened on Calvary. He said, it is not that God ignores prayers at other hours. He said, it is that prayers at 3 are offered at the precise moment when the door is widest open. Maria C. had prayed at 3. She had prayed the specific chaplet tied to that hour. She had directed it entirely toward one soul. And Padre Pio, kneeling in a chapel 50 feet away, saw what happened. What he described to the friar was brief, but dense. He used the word pulled. The soul was pulled. Not drifting, not gradually moving, but pulled. The image he used, according to the margin note, was like a stone lifted from water, heavy, dragging, and then suddenly free of the weight. He saw it happen at the hour, at the prayer, at the intersection of a desperate woman's love and the specific mercy attached to that moment. Now here is where the history gets even more extraordinary. In April of 1937, Faustina herself recorded a vision in her diary that parallels what Padre Pio witnessed. Diary entry number 648 describes a scene she was shown during her prayer at 3 in the afternoon on a day in Holy Week. She writes that she saw a great light descend on a soul that had been in darkness for a long time. She does not say purgatory explicitly. She says darkness, but the context, the surrounding entries, and the theological analysis by Father Serafim Mikolenko, who served as the vice postulator for Faustina's canonization cause and studied her diary manuscripts in Warsaw for over 2 decades, all indicate she was describing a soul in the state of purgation. Faustina wrote, "I saw the mercy fall on that soul like rain on dry earth. The soul did not earn it. It was given because someone asked and because the hour was right." Padre Pio never met Faustina. He was in Italy. She was in Poland. She died in 1938, and he lived until 1968. But they were seeing the same thing. 2 mystics on opposite ends of Europe in different religious communities, speaking different languages, describing the same mechanism with almost identical imagery. Water, rain, a soul lifted, a soul soaked through with mercy at 3 in the afternoon. Father George Kosicki, a Marian priest who spent decades studying the Divine Mercy devotion and its theological underpinnings, noted in his work with Jesus in the upper room that the convergence between Faustina's visions and the experiences reported around Padre Pio regarding the 3 o'clock hour represents one of the most significant instances of parallel private revelation in the 20th century. He noted that neither mystic was aware of the other's specific formulations about the hour, yet both arrived independently at the same conclusions about its power. 3 in the afternoon, the same hour, the same mercy. 2 witnesses who never exchanged a single word. Let us go back to Maria C. for a moment, because her story does not end in that corridor. She returned to Foggia, and according to Horvat's compilation, which includes a follow-up testimony she gave to her parish priest in 1961, she began praying the chaplet at 3 every day for the following year for her brother. She described a change in her interior state that she said she could not explain rationally. The despair lifted, not immediately, not in a single day, but progressively over weeks, until she described it as feeling that the grief had transformed into something she called certainty. Not certainty that her brother was in heaven, she was careful about that, but certainty that he was in God's hands and not in the place she had feared. In 1961, 20-something years after the event at San Giovanni Rotondo, she gave her testimony to her parish priest specifically because she wanted it recorded before she died. She was an old woman by then. She said she had carried the story for decades and was afraid of dying with it unspoken. Her parish priest wrote it down. That document eventually reached Horvat's researchers through the Diocese of Foggia. The detail that stands out in her testimony, the detail that cannot be explained away, is this. She described what Padre Pio said to her in the corridor as containing information she herself did not have. He told her her brother was not where she feared. She had feared hell. She had not told anyone at the friary about her brother, his death, his manner of life, or what she was praying for. Padre Pio knew the specific fear she was carrying and addressed it directly, without being asked. She had not given him her brother's name. She had not described the accident. She had not mentioned when he died. Padre Pio simply told her, not where you feared. That phrase, not where you feared, is the kind of precision that separates a genuine mystical encounter from a general consolation. A general consolation says, God is merciful, and your loved one is okay. A genuine mystical encounter addresses the specific, private, unspoken terror in the exact words that will reach it. That is what Padre Pio did in 4 minutes in a corridor in San Giovanni Rotondo on April 12th. Now let us talk about the broader pattern, because this was not the only time Padre Pio witnessed the intersection of the chaplet, the hour, and a soul's rescue. Father Eusebio Notte, one of Padre Pio's close assistants in the 1950s and 60s, recorded in his personal notes, later compiled and partially published in Italian, that Padre Pio told him directly on at least 3 separate occasions that the Divine Mercy Chaplet prayed at 3 in the afternoon for the souls of the dead operated on a different level than almost any other prayer he had witnessed. Padre Pio was not dismissing other prayers. He was drawing a distinction based on what he had observed. He told Father Eusebio, when the chaplet is prayed at 3, something happens in the room where the soul is being purified. I cannot explain it in human language. I can only tell you what I see. The suffering changes quality. It is still suffering, but it becomes lighter, like the difference between carrying a stone and carrying bread. Both have weight, but one nourishes while you carry it. He used the word nourishes. A soul in purgatory, Padre Pio believed, is not only suffering, it is being fed. And prayers from the living, especially prayers connected to the Passion at the hour of the Passion, feed that purification in a way that accelerates what might otherwise take much longer. He also said something to Father Eusebio that almost nobody quotes. He said that souls in purgatory are aware of the living. They know who is praying for them. They cannot communicate back, with rare exceptions involving saints or special divine permission, but they receive the prayer the way you receive a letter. You know who sent it. You feel it arrive. And for a soul in purgatory, that knowledge, that someone loves them enough to stand at the foot of the cross on their behalf, is itself part of the healing. Imagine what that means for Maria C.'s brother, a man who lived badly, as she described it, a man who died suddenly, without preparation. Somewhere in his purification, he received a chaplet from his sister at 3 in the afternoon. He knew it was from her, and the mercy came. Padre Pio saw it. Now we need to address the objection that serious Catholics sometimes raise about this kind of material, and we should address it honestly because it is a fair objection. Private revelation is not dogma. The Church does not require Catholics to believe in the specific visions of Padre Pio or Faustina in order to be faithful Catholics. Private revelation, even when approved, is offered as an aid to the faith, not a requirement of it. The Divine Mercy devotion was officially approved by St. John Paul II in 1978 when he was still Archbishop Karol Wojtyla of Krakow, and then globally promoted by him after he became Pope, culminating in the canonization of Faustina on April 30th, 2000. On that same day, John Paul II proclaimed the second Sunday of Easter as Divine Mercy Sunday for the entire Church. But even papal approval of the devotion does not mean every private vision connected to it carries the same weight as defined doctrine. What it does mean is this: the prayer is real, the hour is real, the theology behind the hour of mercy is rooted in the Gospels, and the experiences of Padre Pio and Faustina, examined by church authorities over decades through formal beatification and canonization processes that include rigorous investigation of their writings and visions, were found to be free from theological error. That is the highest standard the Church applies to private revelation. Not that every detail is infallible, but that nothing in it contradicts the deposit of faith. Padre Pio's canonization was completed by John Paul II on June 16, 2002, after a process that included detailed examination of thousands of pages of testimony, medical records from the stigmata investigations, and eyewitness accounts of his mystical gifts. The Church looked at this man's life, his visions, his claims about seeing souls and purgatory and the power of prayer, and said, yes, he is a saint. We present him to the faithful as a model. His life was verified as extraordinary by the standards the Church uses to make that determination. So when Padre Pio says he saw a soul rescued at 3 p.m. by the Divine Mercy Chaplet, we are not dealing with the claim of an unstable mystic. We are dealing with the testimony of a canonized saint whose entire life was scrutinized by doctors, theologians, church officials, and eyewitnesses for decades. Take that for what it is worth, but take it seriously. Now, there is one more layer to this story that almost never gets told. After the events of April 12th, Padre Pio began, according to Father Eusebio's notes, to specifically encourage his spiritual children to pray the chaplet at 3 p.m, not only for the dying and the dead, but for souls who they feared were lost. He made a distinction here that is crucial. He did not say the prayer could save a soul that was already in hell. The Church's teaching, and Padre Pio never deviated from the Church's teaching, is that hell is final. A soul that dies in final impenitence, fully rejecting God to the last moment, cannot be rescued after death. That is not what he was saying. What he was saying is more precise and more hopeful. He said that the moment of death is not always the moment we assume it is. He said that between the last breath and the final judgment, there is a mercy we do not fully understand. He was careful. He was orthodox. He did not invent a second chance after death in the theological sense, but he pointed carefully to the space between a person's last visible moment and the judgment that follows, and he said the prayers of the living can reach into that space. The mercy can arrive there. The love of a mother, a sister, a friend, expressed through the chaplet at 3 p.m, can be present in that final space where the soul makes its ultimate movement toward or away from God. Faustina recorded something almost identical in her diary. Entry number 157, written in 1935, contains these words from the voice she understood as Jesus. The soul that will go to confession and receive Holy Communion shall obtain complete forgiveness of sins and punishment. On that day are open all the floodgates of heaven through which grace flows. Let no soul fear to draw near to me, even though its sins be as scarlet. That entry is specifically about Divine Mercy Sunday. But Father Mikolenko, in his theological analysis of the diary, notes that the imagery of floodgates applies more broadly to every prayer offered in alignment with the hour of mercy. The gates do not stay closed between Sundays. They are permanently open at 3 p.m, every day of the year. April 12th, then, is not unique because of its date. It is unique in this story because it is when a woman went to a friary with a broken heart and stood at the gate at exactly the right hour and pushed it open with a prayer. And a man, kneeling 50 feet away, a man whose hands bled every Friday with the wounds of the same mercy she was invoking, saw the gate open, saw the soul move, saw the mercy land. He wept, not in sadness. In the way you weep at something that is so true and so beautiful that your body does not know what else to do. One prayer, 1 hour. One woman who could not eat and could not sleep and could not stop fearing where her brother had gone. Let us sit with the number for a moment. 1. Because that is the number Padre Pio returned to again and again when he talked about prayer and the dead. Not 100 prayers. Not a novena of 30 days. One prayer, prayed with the whole heart, pointed at the right moment, is enough. He said this to multiple witnesses. He lived it. He had seen it happen. Father Joseph Pius Martin, the American friar, whose testimony is one of the most detailed accounts of Padre Pio's daily life at San Giovanni Rotondo, described Padre Pio in the early 1960s, still making this point to pilgrims and spiritual children. A woman asked him once how many prayers were needed before she could hope for her father's soul. Padre Pio looked at her and said, "One good one is worth more than 1,000 mechanical ones." Then he told her to pray the chaplet at 3. Then he said, "But pray it as if you were the only person standing between your father and judgment, because sometimes you are. Sometimes you are. That sentence should stop everything for a moment, because it says something radical about the role of the living in the economy of salvation. We are not spectators. We are participants. The prayer we make today, at this specific hour, for this specific soul, could be the prayer that tips the scale, not because we earn grace or manufacture it, but because God has chosen to involve us. He has given us access. He has told us the hour. He has taught us the words, and he waits to see if we will show up. Padre Pio believed this down to the marrow of his bones. He prayed for the dead constantly. The testimony of the friars at San Giovanni Rotondo is consistent on this point. He would wake in the middle of the night to pray for souls he had seen in dreams or visions. He would interrupt conversations to pause for a moment of silent prayer for someone who had just died, often knowing about the death before anyone had told him. He once told a woman whose husband had died that same morning, before she had opened her mouth to speak, that he had already been praying for her husband since 2 a.m. when he had seen him pass. He was not a man performing holiness. He was a man who lived inside a world where the spiritual was as real as the physical, and where the suffering of souls not yet in God's presence was a fact he could not ignore any more than he could ignore a person bleeding in front of him. The Divine Mercy. Chaplet, for Padre Pio, was not a devotional accessory. It was emergency equipment. It was the specific instrument shaped for the specific wound of a soul not yet ready for God. And when it was used at 3 p.m, it arrived with the full weight of Calvary behind it. He knew this because he had seen it work. Now we are close to the end of this story, but there is one final detail that almost no one mentions, and it changes the entire frame of everything we have heard. In the friary records at San Giovanni Rotondo, among the documents examined during the beatification process, there is a brief note in Padre Pio's own handwriting. It is not a letter and not a theological treatise. It is a single line written at the bottom of a page that contains some administrative notes about friary schedules. The date at the top of the page has been assessed by archival researchers as being from April, almost certainly in the 1950s. The line, translated from the Italian, reads, "The mercy of 3 o'clock is not a promise for the future. It is a door that is already open. It has been open since 1933. 1933? That is the year scholars, using the most precise historical and astronomical data available, calculate as the most likely year of the actual crucifixion. April 3rd, 1933, is the date that a 3 p.m. solar and lunar calculation points to as matching the gospel accounts of the death of Christ. Padre Pio did not calculate this. He simply knew it, and he wrote it down at the bottom of an administrative page about friary schedules, the way you write a note about something so obvious that it barely needs saying. The door has been open since 1933, and every afternoon at 3, it is exactly as open as it was the first time. Maria C. walked through that door on April 12th. She walked through it with a broken heart and a prayer she barely knew and a brother she was terrified had been lost. And on the other side of the door, a mercy was waiting that did not ask her to be perfect or prepared or deserving. It only asked her to show up at 3, with the chaplet, with everything she had. She showed up, the door was open, and a man whose hands still bled with the same wounds that opened that door saw exactly what happened when those two things met. Cold, still, exact. The door has been open since the 9th hour of the day they called Good Friday. Every afternoon at 3, it is the same door, the same width, the same depth of mercy on the other side. Padre Pio knew this not from reading about it, but from living inside it, from carrying it in his hands and feet inside for 50 years. And on April 12th, at 3 p.m, a woman he had never met proved it in front of him without knowing she was doing anything more than crying in a side chapel.